Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 4. Please follow this order of assigned readings. You can see that we're splitting up the Gary Anderson reading. There's a reason for this. Readings 1 and 2 go together in a sort of point-counterpoint argument, and both deal with the definitional issues that we were working on last week. As we'll see, the authors understand genocide very differently. Anderson is an historian, and Shaw is a sociologist, and the former has a much narrower approach than the latter. Anderson comes back in with reading 3, which opens up the historical context of our case study this week, the Trail of Tears and the wave of Indian removals that began in 1830. Finally, reading 4 will look at the experience of removal from a Choctaw perspective in order to consider the broader ramifications of genocide as social destruction. You see here the list of learning objectives for the week. As usual, use these to frame your discussion post. And like I hinted at in the previous slide, this week's module kinda gets split into two. So readings 1 and 2 correspond with the first 4 learning objectives, and the issues here are mostly conceptual. Objectives 5, 6, and 7 correspond with readings 3 and 4, and without losing sight of the conceptual issues, we'll be dealing with more of the historical context in the latter half of the module. So let's begin by situating this module in the course outline. Unit 1 dealt with keywords and concepts, and we came up with the tripartite, or 3-part framework you see here. Unit 2, which we just finished, focused on physical genocide, at the sharpest end of the destructive spectrum. And if we look ahead a couple of weeks to Unit 4, we'll consider the broader methods of cultural genocide. In the middle here is biological genocide, which we begin this week with Module 4. Biological genocide basically involves the prevention of group reproduction. This can be done through multiple methods, like the ones you see here. As biological genocide fits into the middle of this tripartite framework, I'd even go so far as to suggest that this category is at the heart of genocide. Consider the etymology more closely. Genos comes from the Paleo-Indo-European root word gene, meaning to give birth or beget. Semantic relatives include gender, indigenous, and even nation. All of these words have an association with reproduction. I'll elaborate this point in a minute, but group reproduction occurs along 2 dimensions: biological or sexual reproduction, and social reproduction. And genocide works along both dimensions. Remember, a genos is more than the sum of its parts. It's not just individuals that make up a group, but also symbols, institutions, and habits that are collectively shared. These are all targets of genocide. And as you see here in this quote from Martin Shaw, because groups are social constructions, they can't be completely destroyed just through the killing of individuals. So for this unit, I'm encouraging us to adopt a broad sociological perspective of genocide based on this idea of social destruction, or the destruction of a people and their way of life. I'm going to come back to this issue again and again over the next couple of weeks, and it's such an important issue that I expect you to address it right off the bat in your upcoming synthetic essay number 3. Ideally, this idea should really be part of your thesis statement. So before we even turn to the case study, let's begin with some more definitional work. In reading 1, Anderson argues that what happened against Native Americans was ethnic cleansing, not genocide. This strict categorical distinction is based once again on specific intent, which is that relatively narrow interpretation that's come up in every module thus far. Recall reading 3 from Module 2, Can There Be Genocide Without Intent, by Gunther Levy. Anderson this week follows this earlier reading. Both of these pieces uses the same legal benchmark to disqualify the genocide concept from indigenous North America. Anderson is creative, however, in favoring the concept of ethnic cleansing as an alternative to genocide, strictly conceived. But he's playing the same word game as before. Think about how this word game works. So you set a really high threshold for genocide based on specific intent, and anything falling short of that gets dumped into other, presumably less stigmatizing categories. So a couple of weeks ago, for example, Levy called it structural violence, not genocide. Well, it's the same thing here. Anderson calls it ethnic cleansing, not genocide. This is the word game, and it's basically used to downgrade any moral condemnation against what happened to indigenous peoples. So what is ethnic cleansing? Ethnic cleansing generally refers to the forced removal of an ethnic group from a territory, but it has no formal definition in international law and is not defined as an international crime. You see here the most contemporary legal rubric, as defined by the 1998 Rome Statute. Ethnic cleansing isn't included, although many scholars see it implied under categories B and C, crimes against humanity and war crimes. Among the many acts included under these categories are the deportation or forcible transfer of a population, as well as the transfer by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. This is generally what is meant by the term ethnic cleansing. Now, if we want to add ethnic cleansing to our critical vocabulary in this course, we obviously need to understand and explain its relation to genocide. So Anderson says it was ethnic cleansing, not genocide. But what's the difference? Reading 2 argues that there really shouldn't be a difference, conceptually speaking. If we get rid of the narrow juridical framework surrounding the convention, as well as the strict definitional standard of specific intent, and instead go back to Lemkin's originally broader framework, then we can reclassify ethnic cleansing as part of genocide. So, like I said at the outset, Martin Shaw, the author of Reading 2, is a sociologist, and he begins by outlining Lemkin's sociological approach to the genocide concept. Remember Reading 4 from Module 1, that essay by Dirk Moses and McDonnell regarding Lemkin's research on the Americas? This week's reading by Shaw follows that previous one. And if you recall my video lecture from before, I drew attention to Lemkin's famous 2 phases of genocide passage, which you see again here. Moses and McDonnell pointed to this as evidence that the genocide concept is intrinsically colonial in nature. Now, I'm not sure if Shaw is willing to go that far, but clearly he sees forced removal as a significant part of the process. According to him, genocide involves uprooting a people from their home, from their territory. Think about this from your comparative genocide class. How many cases involve people somehow getting dislocated? Now sure, not all cases of genocide involve colonization, but certainly forced removal is a common feature in comparative genocide studies. So, Reading 2 concludes with the argument that what we call ethnic cleansing is really just the territorial dimension of genocide. So, what do you guys make of this? Can we encompass ethnic cleansing within a broader conceptualization of genocide? Okay, so if Lemkin didn't use the term ethnic cleansing, then where did it come from? Shaw gets into the history of this concept as it emerged in English amongst journalists covering the Balkans during the 1990s. So the phrase is actually a translation from the Slavic language family, although the cleansing euphemism happens to be a pretty frequent theme in comparative genocide studies. Nevertheless, the fact that this is a perpetrator's euphemism, or a word game designed to downplay and cover up a more brutal reality, should give us pause. So Shaw points out the ethical problem of using the term ethnic cleansing without inverted commas in order to draw attention to its hidden meaning. Anderson kind of misses this point, I think. But Shaw in Reading 2 also identifies an analytical problem with the term as well. It's something I touched upon in the previous slide, and it has to do with the conceptual boundary between ethnic cleansing and genocide. Most scholarly advocates of the ethnic cleansing concept admit that the conceptual boundary is rather blurry. But I wonder, is it so blurry and indistinct as to be worthless? The suggestion here is that Anderson is overstating his argument in Reading 1, and trying to draw a sharp line between categories that really overlap to a considerable degree. But what do you think? How serious are these problems with the concept of ethnic cleansing? Okay, so now let's put the conceptual stuff to the side and dive into the case study. Anderson returns in Reading 3, and really this part of the book is where he's more in his element, writing an historical narrative rather than a legal treatise. Remember, he's an historian, not a lawyer. And that's why I included him here, to provide a cursory review of the removal period that began in the 1830s. So, in a nutshell, the removal crisis was caused by conflicting claims of sovereignty between tribal nations, like the Choctaw and the Cherokee, and southern states, especially the state of Georgia, but also Mississippi and Alabama. The latter were relatively new states, and as in the case of California a few decades later, they were eager to expropriate indigenous lands. The problem, however, was that the United States had signed treaties with these tribal nations. Moreover, individual states could not purchase Indian lands directly. Only the federal government could do that. Yet, the election of President Andrew Jackson in 1828 ushered in a change in Indian policy that favored more of a states' rights approach, thereby encouraging southern state legislatures to pass laws that unilaterally usurped or took over indigenous territories. So Anderson walks you through the legal context of this political debate, discussing a series of important Supreme Court cases and legislative developments at the state level. In addition to this political and legal context, Anderson also covers the actual process of removal. Historically, the first removal was the Choctaw, which we'll return to in reading 4. But I want to point out that dozens upon dozens of different tribal nations were removed across the Mississippi River from the 1830s all the way through to the 1850s. All in all, as many as 100,000 indigenous individuals were uprooted. The most infamous case was the removal of the Cherokee Nation in 1838. That case drew so much attention, mostly because of the high-profile Supreme Court case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831. Moreover, the Cherokee removal came at a time when public sentiment nationwide was already starting to sour against the removals, at least outside of the South. Now, Anderson doesn't spend too much time on this specific case, or any other for that matter, but he does provide a usefully broad overview. So, the actual removal process was pretty deadly, and I mean that literally, as in causing physical death. The removals were often undertaken in dire conditions, were hastily prepared, under-provisioned, beset by delays, and often bogged down in cold, wet weather. Large parties often ended up getting concentrated in deportation centers under military command. A lot of people died in these conditions, especially elders and young ones. And these generations are crucial to the social reproduction of a group. The elders are a group's repository of knowledge and tradition, and the young ones represent vigor and hope for the future. Significant losses to these age brackets can be devastating to a group's survival. So even if the military may not have been pursuing policies of physical annihilation, people were dying nevertheless. So really the point here is to consider how the biological and the social interact, and how the physical death of group members can possibly lead to the social death of the group itself. And that's really the point of reading 4 by Donna Akers, who focused specifically on the Choctaw removal from 1831 to 1833. The Choctaw are an indigenous people originally from the American South, as you can see on this map here, and they were removed from the young settler state of Mississippi. Akers, who is herself Choctaw, is an ethno-historian who takes a Choctaw-centric approach in order to understand how the territorial uprooting of a people can threaten their sense of collective existence, or ontology, which is a keyword I'll come back to in a second. But her interdisciplinary background provides a unique methodological approach, using evidence from oral traditions in conjunction with documentary records. Theoretically, this is very crucial, as this approach explains how the Choctaw identified with their territory. In order to understand the inherent identification of the Choctaw people with this territory, we must attempt to step into their cultural worldview. And this is where that keyword ontology comes into play. Ontology is basically the study of existence, or the nature of being. Now, if we take seriously the principle of cultural relativism, or the idea that the values, beliefs, and practices of a group can only be understood within the cultural context of that group, then we have to appreciate the fact that different groups, with their own cultural worldviews, are going to understand and experience reality quite differently. For example, different cultures have their own ideas about what it means to be part of a group, or what a group is. For many of us, growing up in a modern, Western, liberal, individualistic society, we have just one way of looking at the nature of collective existence. But other peoples, especially indigenous peoples, have radically different ontological perspectives. And as with most other indigenous ontologies, the Choctaw see themselves as comprised through a number of relationships, not just between biological relatives, but fictive kinship is an important concept from cultural anthropology, and it refers to how people imagine genealogical connections between themselves. Fictive kin can even be extended to non-human life forms, including landscapes and waterways. In the case of the Choctaw, as with almost any other indigenous people, their ontological constitution as a people includes the land itself. As explained by Akers, they identify with an ancient burial mound in Mississippi known as Naniwaya, which they call the mother of the Choctaw people. This is what you see here. Now, think about this designation of Naniwaya as a quote-unquote mother, and how this reflects a crucial aspect of indigenous kinship theory, especially as it illustrates the connection between territory and identity. Now, indigenous kinship theory is something that we're going to elaborate next week, but the point here is that the idea of a group, or the genos, can be constituted many different ways, so we really need to step out of our own cultural worldview. And as it pertains to this week's topic, for indigenous peoples who closely identify with their territories, getting uprooted and forcibly removed can be socially very destructive. So, in conclusion, this really touches upon our primary learning objective for Unit 3, to describe how dispossession restricts group reproduction and survival. Next week we'll touch upon these very issues when we look at the Lakota people and the Black Hills, as well as the so-called Buffalo Nations of the Great Plains. We'll elaborate some key points we hit upon here, like indigenous kinship theory, so you should see some very important overlaps for your upcoming synthetic paper. In any case, thanks for listening, and I look forward to our discussion on Moodle.